Okay. Um, Today's lecture, this video, is one of the big topics in the AP test. Usually this is a whole day, 1 hour lecture in my classroom. Usually this is attached to a lab that I'll have to include as a short video for you today. Um, And this lecture from today relates to other topics that we would normally see in a field trip um, to Mission Creek. This also relates to the treatment of wastewater. There's a whole bunch of little clumps that will come together based on this lecture by the end of the unit. So usually I would ask, if you were in the classroom, for you to set aside 1 or 2 sheets of paper for study goal number 25. First, there's oxygen in water, and I don't mean the O of H2O. I mean that there are oxygen gas molecules that are dissolved into water. If you look at this screen, the arrows are all pointing at oxygen in water. And I'm sorry if you're a little baby and somebody's telling you some chemistry, we say this is H2O because it's a bottle of water, but it's not just H2O. It's actually pretty rare to find pure just H2O because a variety of gases will dissolve into water. So do salts, so do all sorts of other things. And so H2O is the compound for water, yes, but pretty much all water has dissolved gases in it. This has kind of come up a few times in our class already. And today we're going to talk about the oxygen that's dissolved in water, dissolved oxygen. First of all, there's a couple of terms you may want to know. This is what we call free oxygen or non-compound oxygen. In other words, it's just O2. Fixed oxygen is clumped into something else that's stable, or compound oxygen is in other things that could dissolve into water. So carbon dioxide can dissolve in water, and that would be compound oxygen in the water. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're just talking about O2. The oxygen that you and I breathe, what dissolves into our blood to help our cells do cellular respiration. Remember, this is not the O in H2O. It's just O2. Usually we will talk about parts per million, ppm. That's probably the most common in my experience. In some parts of the world, we would say milligrams per liter. And sometimes people talk about the percent saturation, like of the most you could put in, what percent is there now. But that gets tricky. I don't think we need that. ppm is going to be good enough for us. By the way, dissolved oxygen in your bloodstream, if you're trying to monitor somebody's lung health, dissolved oxygen in your blood is usually measured by percentage saturation. Now, water can hold quite a bit. But we have the spectrum. You can see it on this slide, where right around 9 parts per million or better, things are good. And these numbers are probably worth knowing. I would say below 3 is not healthy. That's bad news. Again, you can see here, fish will breathe that dissolved oxygen. And if you're below 3, that's pretty much nothing can live, or very few things can live. 4 or 5 is considered stressful. 6 or 7 is like doable. 8, 9, 10, that's the good stuff. The most you can get into water, I believe, is 15 parts per million. Depending on the temperature, it has to be right around freezing for that. And yeah, temperature matters. This is a big deal. And as a separate standalone detail, this is something that a college scientist would already have in their brain. Like, you would definitely know this, but high school kids often forget. So just on the side of your paper in a clump, you should probably write down cold water holds more dissolved oxygen. By the way, it holds more dissolved gases of many sorts. It also holds more dissolved nutrients. This is why colder waters are the most productive. That's why the polar regions during the polar summer are the biggest bursts of oceanic productivity, and that's why the whales migrate to the poles to go eat all the krill in the summer, because you've got the long day length and super productive water because it's really cold, so there's a lot of stuff dissolved in cold water. It's funny, like if you're trying to like melt honey in water for tea or whatever, you would want hot water. So this might be counterintuitive. You can see on this little table in the corner of your screen that if you get water up to 100 degrees Celsius, it won't hold any oxygen. And if you get water right next to freezing, it will max out at almost 15 parts per million. All right. Moving on. There's other variables that affect dissolved oxygen levels. I'm not sure how much of this you would need. You probably know that photosynthesis makes oxygen and cellular respiration takes it out. So if you look in the image on this screen, you can imagine that those plants are like breathing out oxygen because photosynthesis, and those fish are cellular respirating the oxygen to do stuff. You already know that cold increases oxygen levels and hot lowers oxygen levels. You probably, I don't know if you would need to know this, but fresh water holds more dissolved oxygen than salt water. You could imagine that the salt is taking up some of the spaces in the water. So fresh water holds more dissolved oxygen and salt water holds relatively less dissolved oxygen. And you should definitely know that interacting with the air adds dissolved oxygen. By the way, you've noticed in my slides that I say DO for dissolved oxygen, and sometimes I just say oxygen, O2. If the O2 is in water, it's dissolved oxygen. Okay. So oxygen is good for life. You need it, I need it. You may be interested to know that inside your lungs, you have a very thin layer of water. We're all breathing underwater. We just carry the water inside our lungs. If your lungs dry out, you suffocate. You cannot breathe straight air. Inside your lung, there's a pocket of atmosphere that is allowing oxygen to dissolve into a layer of water, and then your blood runs along that layer of water and switches gases. So if your blood has a whole bunch of CO2, that's going to escape to the layer of water and to the atmosphere. And then if your blood is low in oxygen, then that's going to go down the concentration gradient from the atmosphere to that layer of water to your bloodstream. So we are like fish. We can only breathe in water. When life evolved to exit water, life carries water with it. All things which breathe out of water need water to breathe. We just keep a very thin layer to do the same trick. CO2 out, oxygen in. Then we use our lungs to just pump atmosphere in and out of our space so that that atmosphere can feed the concentration gradient into and out of our bloodstream. Okay. Plants make oxygen, so aquatic plants would probably make oxygen during the day. animals use up that oxygen dissolved in water like we do when it's in the air here. Um, and we should probably talk about um, bacteria and decomposers, because if they are aerobic, they use oxygen, they need air. If they're aerobic, um, they will use oxygen when they feed. Now we're getting to the big chunk of this lecture, the part where you're really going to need a lot of notes. We call that biological oxygen demand, or BOD, which is the amount of dissolved oxygen needed by life in water. And if the life in the water has a whole lot of food to eat, then they're going to need a whole bunch of oxygen to eat that food. So the level of the oxygen is going to probably, you can guess this, give them a lot of food. They'll have a lot of stuff to eat, so they're going to be really active. So they're going to, use up the oxygen. Now, I need to add to your drawing, which hopefully you made earlier. I believe you have this already. And the problem is, if I write on this screen, it's really difficult because I have to write with my mouse. So if you'll forgive me, I'm going to try to switch devices really quickly. Sorry for the delay. I probably should have just paused that. I should have paused that, sorry. So that was a bit of a delay. Okay. Here's your drawing. Now, I want to first of all tell you what you're looking at. You see the ground at the bottom. You see water flowing that way. Make sure that your water has an arrow, because we're going to need to talk about that. And you see some fish. Let's pretend the thing that's brown is not there yet. Okay. If that thing which is brown was not there, then everything would be normal. So you would have CO2 leaving, because CO2 is going to the air, and you would have oxygen dissolving into the water. That's nice. The fish would be breathing the oxygen and exhaling the CO2. This would be dissolved, so it's not bubbles, it's just dissolved gases. At the molecular level, you've got H2Os with CO2 and O2 moving around in there, so dissolved gases. Fish are happy breathing, and as the water moves, more CO2 comes out of solution, and as the water moves, more oxygen goes into solution. This would be a normal river so far. Right now, there's nothing special happening here. So, happy fish, breathing, CO2, O2 into and out of the water. You do this at your lungs, right? Okay. Now, of course, our class studies how humans interact with their environment. So let's put some humans into this system. That pipe represents organic material, and you should make a list. I probably won't be able to fit all this in here, but this could be sewage. This could be paper pulp. This could be ag runoff. That says agricultural runoff. What else could this be? This could be urban runoff. Like stuff like grass clippings and bird poops and dog and cat poop. This could be whatever. Do I have to keep going? I don't know. Offal? Like the stuff that you get from butchering animals, like slaughterhouse waste. What this is organic waste. And every time I'm in my car, I throw a banana peel out the window, and my wife says, "Dude, why are you littering?" And I'm like, no. That's organic, man. It's just a banana peel. Jah will provide. That banana peel is just there to feed the mice and the birds, man. They'll just decompose it, dude. It's just gonna get recycled because it's organic, it's biodegradable. And my wife is like, you idiot. You teach environmental science. You're supposed to know that just because it's biodegradable doesn't mean it's good. So, watch what happens when you add a bunch of biodegradable stuff to water. Okay? First, I'm going to use red to signify the demand for oxygen. So back here, when you're upriver, there's very little demand for oxygen. It's just the fish cruising around. And there's probably some bacteria on the bottom. So when the fish takes a poop, there's some little decomposer bacteria that will eat that little fish poop. But when you add a whole bunch of stuff, like imagine the runoff you get from a city all getting washed into a river. When you're adding a whole bunch of stuff, or like a wastewater treatment facility that's taking everybody's sewage, all the food disposals, all the laundry machines, all the dishwashers, and all the toilets and showers, taking all the sewer, imagine you're just dumping all that directly into a river. Well, the demand for oxygen will spike when you feed the decomposers. And their activity will slowly decline until they've eaten up all the stuff. But there's going to be a while there. I don't know why my pen is so skinny. For a while there, they will have elevated demand for oxygen because they've got a lot of stuff to eat. Those little microbes are going to have a party because they got a lot of work to do, so they're going to use up all the oxygen. Same as if you started doing jumping jacks in a sealed environment. So that's called the biological oxygen demand. And what we're referring to is the decomposer's activity levels. Okay? Give them something to eat, they're going to be more active. Let me see if I can use a bigger marker. Hold on. Let's see if this is any better. Okay? Now I'm going to add a different color. I want to measure how much oxygen is in the water. And remember, back here, whoa, that's a lot. That's the wrong color too. If we start back here, we're going to have high levels of dissolved oxygen, right? Because there's not much using the oxygen. If you have low demand for oxygen, then you're going to have a lot of oxygen left in the water. As the microbes start to use up more oxygen, then levels will drop. Right? Because, you know, they're doing stuff, so they're going to start to lower the oxygen left in the water. And, you know, as the water moves downriver, there will be more oxygen coming in. And you can see that there's less and less need for oxygen for the microbes. They're not using as much. So over time, oxygen levels would recover moving down the river. This is the level of dissolved oxygen. And in a section of river where decomposers have a lot of work to do, they're going to lower oxygen levels. That's called oxygen sag. And that kind of sounds like slang, but that's actually technical terminology. Part of the river where oxygen levels are depressed by the activity of decomposers. Pause, rewind, write that down. So look what we get. We get distinct rivers, and these have terminology that you should know. First, you get what are called clean zones. That's a part of the river where things are mellow, so very little demand for oxygen because there's not a lot to do. So there's a whole lot of dissolved oxygen left. It's basically saturated. Like imagine your body when you're at rest. You have fully dissolved oxygen into your bloodstream. You chillin'. And because you have dissolved oxygen fully into your bloodstream and you are chilling, your dissolved oxygen levels would be very high. So you could say that your blood was like this river when you're at rest. Very little demand for oxygen, so very high dissolved oxygen. Okay, easy. Now, when you add a bunch of stuff that's going to decompose, this is not a tricky name, but you need to know it. This is called the decomposition zone. And I'm trying to pack this all into an iPad with a crappy writing utensil. On a whiteboard, this would be a lot more legible, but that says decomposition zone. And like I said, this is all terminology that you need to know. Decomposition zone. That's the part where you have compostable stuff coming in. The organic waste is coming into the water. Decomposition zone. And then you get an area where there's such low oxygen that very little life is possible. There's a few terms for this. I'm sorry, but there's a lot of different words that are used by different people who speak different versions of English. So the most common is septic. That means no oxygen. That's a septic zone. But you could also call this anoxic zone. That means not oxygen, anoxic. And some people would call this an anaerobic section of the river. Even though you have interaction with the atmosphere that's adding oxygen to the water, there is such high demand for oxygen that your oxygen levels end up being too low to sustain life. Here we're talking something like maybe 2 to 3 parts per million. Like there's not really enough oxygen in that water for most things to live. The College Board will always draw worms there. They're these very, very small worms. If you've ever kept small cichlids in a tropical aquarium, you may have heard of blood worms. They're sold in dry form and sometimes in live form. They occur in places that are anaerobic. And so the College Board will always draw these little worms at the bottom. You can't even see them now because everything is so crowded on my screen. I'll show you some pictures in a minute. But you might have gone from dissolved oxygen levels of 9, 10, 11 with this decline down to enough to start killing stuff. So at about 4 or 3 parts per million, you've entered the anaerobic zone. Now remember that those decomposers are going to eat up the stuff. So eventually, oxygen levels will start to recover. That's why this is called the recovery zone. That says recovery zone. So you're coming back to levels where fish life is possible. And eventually, you know, because the water's going to keep running downstream and the CO2 is going to leave and the oxygen's going to come back, eventually you'll get back to clean zones. You may have noticed I actually drew the fish knowing that they would only live in the clean zones of a river. They were right at the ends for a reason. This drawing got really jumbled, and I apologize, but I kind of knew that was going to happen. I'm going to switch screens again, so take a screenshot if you want it. Here's that fresh drawing that you started with, and here's the College Board version or your textbook's version of that drawing. Same thing that we talked about. Clean zone has high levels of dissolved oxygen, 9, 10, 11, 12 parts per million, high levels of dissolved oxygen, because there's very little demand for oxygen. Now, where you add stuff that decomposes, oxygen levels will drop because now that oxygen's all being used up by the decomposers. You just started a decomposer party. All that bacteria's got stuff to do. So they're all doing jumping jacks, and the biological demand for oxygen has gone up. So you'll get a part of the river where oxygen is so low, the oxygen sag, that life is not possible. There's your mosquito larvae, which technically are breathing at the air from the atmosphere, and there's those worms I told you about. For some reason, the College Board is really focused on bloodworms. They're like an indicator species. They tell you something about the environment. In the recovery zone, you can see that dissolved oxygen's coming back up. That's because you're interacting with the atmosphere. And you know, with less activity, the water can now hold more oxygen. So some stuff can live in the recovery zone and eventually a clean zone again. You can see the parts per million numbers at the bottom. And here's another drawing of the same stuff. I'm done with the drawings. If you thought mine were crappy, you may prefer to take notes off this. Remember when somebody throws a banana peel out the window, that even though it's biodegradable, that can still have a huge impact on waterways. And organic material is like a sneaker topic. Because this is the way that we always teach high school kids about dissolved oxygen and biochemical oxygen demand, those zones, the decomposition, septic, recovery, and clean, you really should know those. College Board loves to ask you about them. Thank you for watching my horrible video.